Hey team, Dr. Jack Audie, and in this series of videos, I'm going to talk about how cells and tissues adapt to different stresses. Physical stress, metabolic stress, what do cells do under these conditions and how do they do it? So let's jump into it. Now, I'm going to talk about cell adaptations and maladaptations. So this is sometimes the body responds and the way it responds is not necessarily beneficial to the situation. Here I've just got a picture of some muscle fibers. And these are muscle cells. And you can imagine the muscle cells are actually growing out of the screen right now. The muscles are growing towards you. And we've taken a slice like that, and now we're looking at the end of it. And we can see each of those is actually a very large muscle fiber and a muscle cell all wrapped up in those little weird sort of hexagon shapes. Now, the reason why I tell you about this is because the muscles in your body are some of those cells that really have to respond to changes and stresses, particularly mechanical stress. Now, when I talk about how cells and tissues are going to respond, I'm going to address these four terms: hypertrophy, hyperplasia, atrophy, and metaplasia. Now, let me jump into each of those and talk about how certain tissues can undergo these responses in response to serious stresses. So first, let's look at hypertrophy. Now, hypertrophy is an increase in organ or tissue size in response to an increase in cell size. Now here we actually have those same muscle fibers, and what's been labeled in red is actually the little sort of fibrous capsule that goes around the muscle fiber. And so inside each of that black dot is a cell. And what we can see is that the mice that have received no exercise compared to the mice that have received exercise, we're seeing hypertrophy. We're seeing the cells go from small to big. And that's literally because the cells are now packing themselves out with ribosomes to produce more protein and those actin and myosin filaments, those proteins that make up the muscle. So each cell now has more contractile protein units as well as more ribosomes to produce those contractile units. And that's what's causing the cells to swell, which causes the tissues to swell. Now, hypertrophy of muscles can be good. That's Sonny Bill Williams. He's a rugby player. I'd be concerned if my wife was near this guy. If my wife ever leaves me, it's because of this guy. I swear, she has a big crush on him. It's Sonny Bill Williams. So hypertrophy can be good, right? So obviously, Sonny Bill Williams has put his muscles under mechanical stress. That activates various receptors that literally sometimes there's receptors in the membrane that are sensing the stretch of the membrane. There are also all these receptors attached to the muscle fibers themselves that can detect this intense strain that Sonny Bill Williams has put his muscles under. And so the cells have undergone hypertrophy, produce more muscle fibers and more ribosomes within those cells, and the cells have swollen up, and so have his muscles. However, hypertrophy can also be maladaptive. Now, this is to people's hearts. And what you can imagine is we've just chopped the heart like that. Now we're looking at it like that. Now, what we can actually see is one of those hearts has undergone hypertrophy. It's actually really, really big. And the reason why it's done that is actually a maladaptive process. It's not great that that heart has now swollen up and become massive, and the cells within that have produced more ribosomes and more filament fibers to make that heart stronger. Now, the reason why it's done that is it needs those thicker muscles to overcome the resistance of blood flow. So it's actually exactly like Sonny Bill Williams' arms. The blood vessels of these patients have become clogged with cholesterol and atherosclerosis, and clogging a pipe, clogging those blood vessels makes it harder to push liquid through, right? You're trying to push the liquid through, but it's harder. So blood pressure goes up because you're pushing so hard that the pressure goes up inside the blood vessels, but also you need a stronger heart in order to squeeze that blood through those clogged blood vessels, those clogged arteries. And so we actually get hypertrophy of the muscle in the heart. But this causes problems because you can see that the ventricle, which is the cavity which fills up with blood whenever the heart contracts. So the ventricles fill up with blood, and then the heart contracts and squeezes out the blood. And then it fills up with blood, and then it contracts and squeezes the blood out of the heart. Now, those ventricles are essentially wrapped with muscle. So as the muscle gets bigger and bigger, the ventricle gets smaller and smaller. And you can see that it's actually squeezed smaller and smaller. So now the heart is doing these big, powerful movements to try and get that blood through those thick blood vessels. And the heart rate can actually slow down because it's so big and it's trying to squeeze that blood through those clogged arteries. But it's actually producing such a little amount of blood per stroke, per contraction. There's lower stroke volume, there's lower blood coming out of that. And so this can actually form sort of a cycle. It now can't keep up with the blood supply, so it's trying to pump even harder. The muscle gets thicker, the ventricle gets smaller, and this is myopathy. This is bad for the heart and it can lead to heart failure. So this is a maladaptive response to an increase in blood pressure, an increase in clogged vessels. Those thick muscles can actually start creating problems rather than solving it. So that hypertrophy is not great. Now, hyperplasia compared to hypertrophy, hyperplasia is an increase in cell number within a system or an organ or a tissue. So instead of the cells getting bigger, we're getting more cells. And I've got two examples here. So this is normal skin, and we can see the keratocytes up here and the epidermis and the dermal layers look normal here. But under hyperkeratosis, we get an increased production of keratinocytes, and we get that a much thicker layer of that keratin, that dead outer layer on your skin. And this is hyperplasia. Now, this could be caused by a number of things from inflammation, from toxins, but a number one cause is persistent physical irritation. So if your skin is persistently getting irritated, we can get the formation of that thick keratin layer, and that is a hyperplasia. But once again, this can be good and this can be bad. And I'm actually a big fan of this first one. Not feet in general, not a huge foot fan, but I'm a big barefoot wearer. I like wearing bare feet. And when you wear bare feet, when you start wearing bare feet, your feet will be very sensitive and it will have thin skin. And as you walk on the road, you'll be going, ooh, ow, ee, ooh, ow, ee. But then as you adapt to the barefoot lifestyle and you get those spread out toes when you go barefoot shoes and everything, that's me. Talk to me about this later. Anyway, I'm too passionate about it. You don't want to start me down that pathway. But as you walk on the road regularly, I often call these summer feet compared to winter feet. Winter, you're wearing shoes, your feet get really thin skin, and they become sensitive whenever you go barefoot on the road. But by the end of summer, you've been wearing bare feet all of summer, and you'll have thick keratin layers on the bottom of your feet that will provide protection. And it's that chronic physical irritation of walking on the road that has promoted the hyperplasia, has promoted your skin becoming thick and driving a nice, thick, healthy foot pad for you to walk on and not feel any of those stones underneath your feet. However, I'm sorry, I should have given you a trigger warning. Yeah, there's not great images coming up. Yeah, so it can be maladaptive. And certain infections, inflammation I mentioned, also the wrong footwear, also sometimes just not excess moisture, chronic moisture on your foot can trigger this hyperplasic response without the need for it and without the physical irritation actually causing the shedding of those keratocytes in that keratin layer. And so you can end up with this sort of horrible buildup. There are also genetic factors that can lead to this as well. So it can be maladaptive, this hyperkeratosis. Now, atrophy is the opposite of hypertrophy. So you get a decrease in organ size and tissue size due to a decrease in cell size. So here we have, I don't know how they got the ethics for the study, but here we have an animal study where they had the control group and then they had a group which they immobilized. So this group actually couldn't exercise compared to the control group. And what you can see is the muscle cells have actually shrunk and they've literally consumed their own muscle fibers under this point. They've got rid of them because they don't need those muscle fibers. The muscle fibers haven't experienced that great physical strain that we need to promote the growth of those muscle fibers. Now, this can actually be good. Now, it can actually be good when you're switching body types. If you're switching this YouTuber here, he was lifting heavy weights, he was getting big, but he wanted to run a marathon. So he had to switch his muscle type. So his big, heavy muscles aren't great. You want to be light, you want to be mobile, you want to have slimmer muscles that are more efficient and highly vascularized. So it was actually an adaptive response for his muscles to undergo this atrophy here, where he lost like 5 kilos during marathon training. However, it can be maladaptive, this atrophy response. It could be due to low nutrients, it could be due to low use. And this is caused, here we've got this atrophy. A very common one here is, this is called motor neuron disease. And you'll get atrophy of this muscle pad here on your thumb as one of the symptoms that we see there. Now, motor neuron disease is the disease of your motor neurons, both your upper and your lower in your spine, motor neurons. And so you're not actually sending strong electrical signals out to those muscles. The neurons are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so you're not getting the excitation and the contraction of your muscles. And so you start to get muscle wasting going on. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but this is a maladaptive. We want those muscles to remain, but because they're not getting used, the muscles can start to shrivel up and atrophy in a bad way. So this would be maladaptive atrophy. Now, metaplasia is a little bit different. It's kind of a cool one, actually. It's when an adult, mature, differentiated cells will actually change from one cell type to a different differentiated cell type in response to a noxious stimuli. Typically, it's in response to a noxious stimuli. Some sort of chronic bad stimuli is causing this shift. And the reason why this happens is that some cell types are more vulnerable to certain stimuli compared to other cell types. And a really common one is a shift from columnar epithelial cells to squamous cells. Now, when you think about it, your skin is an epithelium and it has squamous cells. And that's because it's got stacked cells that are very tough and they can handle abrasions and they can handle toxins. And if the outer ones die off, you haven't affected the lower, very important layers of the tissue. So squamous cells all stacked on top of each other is quite a robust system. Whereas columnar cells, such as in your respiratory tract lining or your intestinal tract lining, less robust, right? Because there's only one or maybe two layers of them before you get down to those deeper tissues, which might have the progenitor cells that are generating those epithelial cells. It might have capillaries, it might have nerves. It's got all these important things deeper in the tissue. But columnar cells are very good at lots of things, such as absorbing nutrients in your intestine, but also in your lung epithelia, they'll have cilia on them, and the cilia will flick. The cilia will flick debris up your bronchi, up your trachea, down into your stomach. So, however, when there's a consistent and persistent noxious stimuli, sometimes the lung epithelial, the lining of the lung tracts will switch cell type from columnar to squamous because we want those tougher cells rather than the columnar cells. But then you start to lose some of that important stuff like the cilia flex, causing the removal of garbage from your lungs. So you remove some of the specializations of the columnar cells, but you get a tougher cell that can handle the noxious stimuli like a squamous cell, layers and layers of squamous cell. And these are actually mouse cells from mice that were giving vaping. So they were giving a vaping pen, and it's actually from your nasopharynx, so back here, where your nose then goes down into your lungs. And you can see here the column cells here have shifted to multi-layered squamous cells. And this is just a diagram here of what that would look like. So it's gone from these specialized cells with the cilia, you can see the cilia along there. It's gone from these really good specialized cells into these robust, tough cells that aren't doing the full job, right? So they've switched cell types because of this constant chronic noxious stimuli. Is it good or is it bad? Well, it's a bit like duct taping up your bumper. It's an adaptive response. It's a good response to a bad situation. And what we need is that bad situation to go away, so then the squamous cells can switch back to columnar cells. We need to fix the bumper. We can't just tape it up. It's honestly a patchwork. There's also a little bit of evidence that those squamous cells are more likely to grow and to become cancer cells. They're a better source of cancer cells than columnar cells. So perhaps this metaplasia is actually making you a bit more vulnerable. It's hard to pick that apart with the vaping and the smoking or that kind of stuff, but there is some evidence for that. So it's a good response temporarily. Let's move on. Let's get rid of the noxious stimuli so we can return our organ back to full function. It's a duct tape. It's neither good nor bad. We're just trying our best. All right, so these responses can be regulated by mechanical stress, I mentioned, like getting your foot rubbed on, whacked by the road. Hormonal changes can also initiate some of these responses. Some of these responses, you can imagine, are part of normal development. So hyperplasia, for example, hyperplasia can occur when you develop memory tissues as you go through puberty. So they are often in responses to hormones, and they're part of just development sometimes. But sometimes also inflammation and metabolic stress can also cause these responses. That really thick skin is commonly caused by chronic inflammation. So psoriasis often gets that really hyperplasic skin, and so you can get really thick skin from having that chronic inflammatory response in your skin. Now, how does it all get regulated? Well, I'm going to look at one specific example and how it can cause some of these responses in the next video, and that's going to be hypoxia, which is a stress that tissues can undergo, and we can end up with different responses due to the hypoxia happening in different tissues. So let's go jump into that next.